Okay. Let's get started. Tom Kupchak, Hurricane Labs, an effective approach to defense in depth.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to B-Sides. I know we already did the welcome with them, but I'm going to do that again. So, this talk is one of those talks that is designed to cover a topic that is something that can be very boring if done poorly. And pretty much my goal with this talk was to come up with something that covered defense in depth in a way that didn't suck. So hopefully, if no one's asleep at the end of this talk, I did my job well. If you're all asleep, you can have lunch later. We'll go with that. But I'm Tom Kupchak. I'm a senior security engineer at Hurricane Labs. We're based out of Cleveland. We do Splunk, network management, all that kind of fun stuff. And I get the opportunity to reach out and give presentations, also lead our operations team. And it's great to be here. So without further ado, talk a little bit about defense in depth. And this kind of parallels the talk that happened previously, where we covered some of the pen test tactics. Like they said, it's not difficult to break in. If you're a red team, your job is easy. You just need to find the little crack in the castle wall. And really the whole analogy that I'm going with for this presentation, the security castle, instead of talking about, obscure technical things, I want to really use this extended analogy of the castle throughout this entire presentation. So all the imagery that we're going to use in this that was created by our designer is going to focus on that whole practice of trying to make this a medieval theme. So I think that's going to be a little bit more interesting and different from what you would normally see at a security conference presentation. So yeah, breaking in is easy, and attackers, they only need to find the little crack to get in, the tiny hole in the castle wall. There could be a domain admin account that's escalated privileges like we covered previously. There could be a spear phishing attack on a single user. And from that point, you can pivot to somewhere else in the network and basically do almost everything once you find a single vulnerability. Now, on the blue team side, which is a lot of my specialty, you are having to struggle with trying to defend all that and trying to deal with all the different possible ways an attacker can get in. And they only need to find the one thing that you missed, which really kind of stinks. So we need to try to find a way to leverage our defenses in such a way that we protect the fortress that is our company's infrastructure. And defense in depth is the way to do that. One of the things that I see all too often is we have our existing controls. We have firewalls, we have security software, we have web application for filters, we have all these defenses that are layered on top of each other. And then we also want to say, there's this new shiny new technology that comes out and we want to spend money to buy that too. All too often though, the existing controls that we have are not optimized in such a way that they are the most effective at defending something. We have poor configuration on our firewalls. We have any rules that allow all kinds of traffic. We're having vulnerable client applications and vulnerable plugins. And all of these work together to kind of defeat the defenses that we have. And then we're looking at spending more money and putting more defenses in and just really not being effective to use what we have. And I understand that there's always the cool shiny new security thing. Everyone has pushes for upgrading that, using that, but we can do more with what we have. So really one of my goals in this presentation is not to say, hey, you guys need to go spend more money on something, because I understand I come from a security vendor and part of our job is to have people buy services and things and all that, but that's not what I'm trying to go for. Use the controls that you have and try to use them to be more effective and defend your infrastructure and your castle more effectively. So, spending more on security, of course, doesn't mean that you're going to get more security. And really, by minimizing your costs and kind of like echoing from our previous talk to keep going back on that, use the free methods, use the tools that are available to first make a case politically for ultimately spending more money on something that you could use down the road. But start small and then go from there. So this is where I want to introduce the concept of defense in depth. The layers of defenses on top of each other to better defend the organization's crown jewels. And really the concept of defense in depth is the idea of layers of protection. And this is where we go to the castle theme. You can think of your organization as a castle, and you have different forms of assets in this castle. In the castle you have gold, which is obviously a very tangible asset. You have the people who are living in the castle, because the castle was the kind of like the premier defense of its time. You had the peasants who lived in there, the servants. You had the fair maiden. You didn't want anything bad to happen to her. So we protect all of these parts of the castle. And we use layers of protection. We have the moat, that's kind of in the background. There's the big walls, there's guards. All of these defenses work together to make the castle the premier defense of its time. And we should think of our defense and our organization in the same way. So one of the principles that us security people like to talk about until we're blue in the face is the idea of least access, where all forms of access are completely and tightly controlled. It's a utopia. It doesn't happen, but it's something we should strive for. Users and administrators, they should only have the access they need to do their jobs. If your administrators are doing administration work, that's when they would escalate their privileges to a role where they have administrative permissions. Otherwise, they would be running as normal users, kind of reducing the risk of that. We usually think of this as an admin, or as a user perspective, limit what your users can do, but yeah, the way that we want to do this on organizations, to have our admins be limited as well and only use administrative permissions when they need them, that's also important. What this does is it reduces the scope of an attack. When you're doing your spear phishing attacks and sending out your emails to try to attack users, most of the time it's not necessarily going to be an admin like we said previously. It's going to be someone who is just going to be your average user. If your average user is a domain admin, God help you, pretty much. Because everything is just going to be able to go downhill from there. However, if your average users don't have permissions to install software or do other changes to your infrastructure, you're going to be more likely to have those users not compromise the systems the same way as an admin would be compromised. Then we get to the idea of firewalls. This is the outside defense of your castle. And I know there's been talks recently about firewalls being less relevant and less useful. That's not true. Castles, they had your big walls, you had your moats, you had those defenses. They were there for a reason. And pretty much what the castle was designed to do was funnel all of the traffic into a single point of entry that was well protected, but it was known and observed as a vulnerability. You had the drawbridge, you had the guards there, you had the holes where you could pour boiling oil and shoot arrows down at the bad people. That's what your firewall's doing. Castles, they didn't have multiple entries. They weren't shopping malls where you could come and go as you pleased. Everything was well controlled. Your organization should be handled the same way for network traffic. Anyone that's coming in, any traffic that's coming in should get inspected. It should be decided, hey, is this service allowed to talk to this server? And using the firewall is really the best way to do that at the outside and the initial defense. But by itself, it's not necessarily going to be the best way to secure a system, because firewalls can get bypassed easily. A lot of times what we think about is firewalls being more than just, all too often you think you see incoming traffic for your firewall. It's more than just incoming traffic. You also have outbound filtering that you need to consider for firewalls. So let's just say someone passes the inspection at the castle gate. They walk through, they get checked by the guards, you know, the medieval equivalent of the TSA, pats them down. They get the go ahead, they're in the castle. Should they be allowed to do everything they want? Let's say they saw some gold and wanted to put that in their pocket. Let's say they really liked the Fair Maiden and wanted to run off and write the medieval equivalent of a tailor's foot song. You know, pretty much that's not something you want to have happen. You want to have that inspected when you leave the firewall as well, which would be at the castle gate. So what I see, and this is less and less common, but a lot of organizations still allow everything to go out of their network. The firewall will protect what comes in, but if you're allowed to make a communication outbound, that's just going to be allowed by the firewall. And that's bad. That makes the job of someone trying to exfiltrate data easy. It makes exploits really work well because they don't have to worry about expecting outbound connectivity. They can just hit whatever they want. So don't assume that everything leaving your network is legitimate, just like you don't assume everything coming into your network is legitimate. And really, just by restricting that access, you can stop a lot of some of the basic and non-specialized malware from being effective. Because there is a lot of malware that will still try to connect outbound on high ports. It's less common. You're going to see a lot more in HTTP and HTTPS anymore, because that's pretty much going to be more likely to be allowed. But there is a lot of the legacy stuff that will still try to communicate outbound on high ports. Also, you have the idea of intrusion detection and prevention. In the castle analogy, these are your guards and your alarms. Essentially, your guards and your soldiers, they would see something that was going on, they'd sound the alarm. And these would be indicators of there being a threat or a potential problem well before that this actually was something that happened. Things to bear in mind, though, with IDS and IPS, not everything is a threat. You could have people who were walking by your castle, medieval teenagers, they pick up a rock, they throw it at the wall of the castle. That's not a problem. That's a port scan. Same thing that you see now. Do you want to get alerted about everything that happens against your firewall, your outside IP range, that is potentially somehow bad to something? No. You never sleep. So, a lot of times what I see is you'll get a report of all the IDS activity on a network, and it's like this long, and it's like port scan, bad stuff, you know. All of that stuff is not necessarily things you need to worry about. You need to worry about things that you're vulnerable to. So in the case of the castle analogy, let's just say the guards noticed an attack coming in from CVE 1426 cannon. The cannon was a vulnerability, or it was something that the castle was vulnerable to. That's what made castles obsolete. So if an attacker was coming at a castle with a cannon, there would be problems, and that would be something that the guards would need to take action to. That's exactly how we should handle IDS and IPS. We should be alerting and responding to things that our infrastructure is vulnerable to, and not necessarily caring about the guy who's throwing the rock at the wall, who is not really a threat. Also, there's the idea of network segmentation. Once inside the castle, you shouldn't just have free reign of everything in the castle. There are different roles and different responsibilities in there. Obviously, the knights are going to be having more access in the castle than others, but even in the case, let's just say the Fair Maiden again, you don't want the knights to be able to spend too much time there. They might be able to walk by and say something like, hello. The peasants, they don't got a chance even. So they would be segmented off. Same way, not that we're calling users peasants, but similar idea, they would not be able to access everything in the network. They shouldn't be able to log into servers that they don't need to access. And the knights could be your system administrators. They still don't need to be able to access everything. Your DBAs might need to be able to access databases, but they shouldn't be able to manage your corporate website. Those sorts of separation of roles. In the event of a user getting compromised, they won't be able to do every single thing on a network at a time. The way that this usually works is with DMZs, where you have servers separated on different networks according to role. And then you can use the firewall or some other device to separate that traffic. So in the case of this example, you have a web server that needs to talk to a database. More often than not, your web server and database are going to be running on separate systems. If they're not on the same system, this isn't going to be as practical. But what you can do in this case is you can allow the incoming traffic to the web server, and then the web server can be allowed to talk to the database server. And the firewall rules can be written in such a way that the web server is only allowed to communicate to the database server on those ports. Not everything else in the network can talk to the database server, and the internet cannot talk directly to the database server. So what this requires someone to do is to come in through the firewall, exploit the web server, which isn't that difficult, and then use that access to pivot into the database. So you at least put an extra step in there, and then not everyone in the organization has access to the database server. So you're separating these roles and making it the attacker's life harder. So you don't have automatic access to this, and they might overlook this access depending on how they're trying to exfiltrate data or access the network. The nice thing about network segmentation is it's basically free. Most of the time your firewalls are already going to support this. You're going to have switching in place to accomplish this. You're just going to have to sometimes renumber depending on how it's built out on your network, which can be harder than it looks and sounds in some cases. But it is something that can be added into an infrastructure with minimal cost and effort. It is a change, though, that has to be made. Also, it's important to look at fixing vulnerabilities in your castle as they're discovered. So, stone walls break down, just like the roads in Pittsburgh and Cleveland. As the weather and the elements beat down on these things, they need to be patched. Same thing happens for software. Your software, it gets not worn out, but there are vulnerabilities that are discovered in it, and patching is important. And we look at application updates and security updates as kind of like the necessary evil. When you see a bug or a patch that's released for a software, that means some developer did something very, very horrible. And that very, very horrible thing that a developer did is resulting in the software being broken in such a way that it allows some bad guy to do whatever they want with the software. So you have this software application that gets Band-Aids slapped on it left and right, and I'm really glad I don't have to write software because it just sounds like a very miserable thing to do. How many of you write software? Okay. I'm sorry, I pity all of you. But the fact that you're having all these patches that happen in software and these vulnerabilities that are discovered, you're going to have to do updates all the time. Not just your application, not just your operating system updates like the Patch Tuesday ones, but you also have your Adobe updates, if you have to run Java, those Java updates that are in there. Those are a lot of the primary targets for attacks. When you have a spear phishing attack trying to get someone to click on a link in a web page, a lot of times they're going to be directed to what's called an exploit kit page. And that just basically is a cookbook of every possible exploit thrown at a poor user who happens to go there. More often than not, they're going to be exploiting browser vulnerabilities, plugin vulnerabilities. If you have any sort of vulnerable plugin or browser or application, these exploit kits are designed to find those and find a way to get into the network, and then allow the machine to make an outbound connection so that the attacker has a command and control channel. By fixing some of these vulnerabilities, at least the known ones, you're reducing the scope and effectiveness of those automated type tools. Targeted attack is going to be a lot more effective, but most of the attacks that you would see are going to be the basic spread a wide net across the internet and see what you can catch. The other thing, just to go back to fixing vulnerabilities, you do need to run supported software. This is less of a case now, but I'm sure we're still seeing XP in 2000 machines laying around. They don't get security updates, so we run into the same problems. Now also web proxies. This is a little bit less common, but it is a really great way for reducing some of the vulnerabilities that you see with outbound traffic. So what the proxy does is it basically goes in between the computer connecting to the internet and the internet itself. And you're forcing all of the software on the computer to go through the proxy as opposed to having a direct connection to the internet. This can have really significant impact on the success of malware, because a lot of malware is not designed in such a way that it's proxy aware. It assumes that it's going to have a direct connection to the internet and be able to get out and talk to everything. Unfortunately, a lot of applications aren't proxy aware, so it is an administrative overhead to do this. But by adding the layer of having a web proxy in place, you really are making a lot of malware less effective. And it does significantly improve your security. Combining the proxy with outbound filtering, a lot of your type of command and control malware is going to not work as effectively, or at least you're going to have a way to detect that, so that you can take action as quickly as possible when it's detected. Also, there's the idea of the application layer firewall, which is sometimes referred to as a reverse proxy. What we understand in this case is that web applications, things that are running on web servers, they have vulnerabilities. You run into buffer overflow attacks, there's cross-site scripting, there is SQL injection that happens. All of these different types of attacks and vulnerabilities exist in applications. And sometimes you can't necessarily fix them. In a utopian, perfect world, your web applications wouldn't have vulnerabilities, and when they're discovered, the developers would be able to solve all the problems. But looking at the poor people who have to write software that's different than how it actually works. You're gonna run into cases where the guy who wrote the code isn't there anymore, or the application isn't supported anymore, or we need to get this application yesterday, and you security people are slowing us down, and why do we always have to do these pen tests that make us look bad? I hear that from different customers all the time when they're trying to have to go through the pen test. So, from an application layer firewall, it's kind of a band-aid in a way, but it's a way of putting an additional layer of defense in front of a web server. So, if the web application firewall sees SQL injection coming in, it's going to filter that before it gets to the vulnerable web app. So, building these layers on, ideally you have good firewall rules at the beginning, you have your web application firewall to filter out some attacks, and then you have a patched web server that isn't vulnerable to these sorts of things. So by layering these, even if you have a failure at one level, you have the ability to better secure the whole entire environment. And then there's also the idea of positive access control and the separation of roles. And we touched on this a little bit before, but I want to go in a little bit more depth there. For example, in the castle, the king, he just doesn't cook, he doesn't defend the castle. We're not really sure what he does, but he's the king. But in terms of the king, he shouldn't be able to do things that require that level of access. So he doesn't need to have access to all of the defenses of the castle. He just needs to be able to tell the people who are responsible for that to defend the castle instead. Just like your developer and your application administrators, they shouldn't be able to make firewall rules because bad things will happen. You're going to end up with a lot of any rules. You're going to end up with a lot of just open connectivity because the networking side, they want things to just work. They don't want to deal with those pesky security people being in the way. Your administrators who are dealing with software, a lot of times they don't even know what ports are going to be used for a service to work through a firewall, which I don't blame them because a lot of times the people who write the software don't know what ports are needed either. So it's kind of a two-way sword on that. But really, to have that cooperation between the two sides where your security team is working with the networking team and application team and the database administrators so that there is no one single person who's responsible for making all these changes, it definitely allows this access to be better controlled in a larger environment. And then really, security and IT, they should work together and not against each other. So I got another utopian thought in my head, but all too often what I see is security is kind of like the no, you can't do that. That's going to make things less secure. And then security is always going to be like, now the business wants me to do this, so now we have to break down all our security. You guys can relate to that, right? It's the battle that you face. Instead of making security the team of no, we can't do that, I think we should try to make security the team of the how can we make that work while still maintaining the security of the environment. Understanding that users are going to have to do things, there's going to be unique requests that you have to deal with. And using that as opportunities to give and take while allowing the business to still do their core business function, which is not security in most cases. But to have that buy-in so that everyone starts thinking from a security perspective in order to make the security of the organization as a whole better. And then also restricting user access. Users general should never run with administrative access unless they need it. Just like administrators shouldn't run with administrative access even when they need it, with the exception of when they're actually doing an administrative function. I've talked to customers who have moved from the model of having administrative access everywhere to customers who have restricted that. And they've really seen a huge drop in the number of spyware infections and unwanted applications and all that have happened. There was an initial period of growing pain for that, where users who were just used to installing everything had to go through their service desk for changes. And it was, an adjustment. But after they got through the initial month or two of dealing with that, their effort and the amount of time that they spent on an IT perspective of cleaning up malware infections and dealing with user workstation problems, it dropped significantly. And really that was just by modifying the permissions of what the users were able to do and locking down the access. How many of you in your organization try to restrict user access to that? It's still a pretty small number. How many of you would allow access everywhere? Oh, that's good. Good. I'd like to see that. So that's the move I want to see. As we're reducing that access for users, it does make users less targeted and less subject to more of these types of attacks. And I see similar results for Citrix users and servers that are terminal servers, the same benefit. And really a lot of the IDS alerts that you see in these environments, once you have restricted user access, they're more informational. Like an exploit kit was attempted to run against a client and it failed. And that's what you like to see as a security administrator. And yeah, client protection is still something that's very important. Antivirus, I know it gets a bad rap, and it's not, if you have antivirus, all your problems are not going away. But you also don't want to not have some kind of client protection in place. Also, for your more sensitive applications, you could do some host intrusion protection and defension. Basically, trying to see when a host is compromised, see when users log into machines, and if you see a bunch of failed logins followed by a success, that can be an indicator of compromise. Also, there's full disk encryption as an option for any type of machine that has sensitive information that might be carried in and out of the building. Definitely a good thing to have in place. Not perfect, of course. And then Java just sucks and it's annoying. But if you don't have to have Java on machines, don't put it on there. But unfortunately, there are many companies where your most critical business application was written in Java by some guy who doesn't work there anymore and no one knows how to change the code. So there's problems that you run into too. If you don't have to have Java on every machine, don't put it on every machine. If you have some users that need it, only put it on those machines. Restrict that scope as much as possible. So finally, I want to wrap things up by bringing everything together. A lot of these recommendations are just that, they're recommendations. Depending on what your organization is doing, you might have some of these in place, you might have many of these in place. But there might be always areas of improvement or ways that you can layer these defenses better. Really what I tend to find is that your smaller type of changes are the ones that get the most success at implementation, and they're the more likely to get approved in an organization. If you wanted to just say, hey guys, I'm going to come to work on Monday and turn off all outbound access except for things that I think are important across my entire organization, you're probably going to have your coworkers think you're insane, and rightfully so. I have done it before at an organization that had a bad malware infection and just basically like, guys, we need to shut off outbound access. And they're like, okay. I'm like, what? But that actually did a good job at stopping that type of malware that they had because it was not going out on regular HTTP and HTTPS ports. But to try to do that on a big organization, it's not going to be something you're going to be able to do right away. But you might be able to do something like analyzing your log data to see what services are being used, and then locking down outbound access to services that are not on that list. And kind of chipping away at the block and figuring out how your network works. That kind of is an approach if you're not really sure what's being used. If you have documentation and you have a better understanding of how your network operates, you might be able to do something differently. But really, piecing together and trying to work with what you can as a security person, that gives you leverage long-term as you're trying to sell the position of security to your organization. You have the ability to demonstrate then to your management that this is what we were able to do with the firewall that we have. Using this open source IDS, we detected these threats. And then you can say, okay, now that we've done this work with what we have, now I need more help from you guys to be able to support this larger project. This new shiny firewall, this better client protection system. And you can leverage those together to really overall benefit your security as an organization as a whole. So with that, I'd like to open the floor for questions, and thank you very much. Oh, question, okay.
What if you don't own the castle?
There are ones for sale in Europe, and they often cost less than a house in New York City, or at least an apartment. So I think there's a list on the internet I've seen definitely like castles that cost less than New York City apartments. The problem you run into with that though is Wi-Fi coverage.
Westinghouse had a program for Europe.
Just put it in your boat and drive over the ocean. It'll work great. Thank you, everyone.